Solving quadratic equations. We know what equations are. We recognize them because they have an equal sign, which means they can be solved. We recognize linear equations because all the variables will have an exponent of 1, and hence we'll graph a line. So now we're going to introduce quadratic equations where the variable's exponent will be greater than 1. More specifically, the largest variable's exponent will be 2. So the graph will not be a line. It's going to be in the shape of a U called the parabola. It could be a U that either opens up or a U that opens down. We'll talk more about the graph a little bit later on, but in the meantime we need to learn how to solve these quadratic equations. The standard form for a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0, and this is the form we want to begin by getting the equation in. If it's already not in standard form, get it into this form. All the terms on one side of the equation, setting it equal to 0. Then what we're going to do is basically just factor, following all the same factoring steps that we've been working on. Once it's completely factored, we set all the factors that have a variable equal to 0 and then solve each one of those remaining equations. So example 1, we recognize it has an equal sign, so an equation is certainly not a linear equation. All the variables have an exponent of 1. And right now, the largest exponent is actually 3, which is still too large for a quadratic. But we know by factoring, get it in standard form, set equal to 0, which it is. So we begin by factoring out the greatest common factor. By factoring out an x, now it becomes a quadratic equation. Now the largest exponent is 2. Continue on factoring, trinomial, where a is equal to 1, factors into x minus 9 times x plus 7 equal to 0. At this point, it's completely factored. We have a total of 3 factors, x, x minus 9, x plus 7. So now in order to solve the actual equation, we take each factor that has a variable and set it equal to 0. Well, in this case, all 3 factors have a variable. Beginning with the first one, x, set it equal to 0. The second factor, x minus 9, set it equal to 0. And the third, x plus 7, set it equal to 0. The first equation obviously is already solved, giving us our first solution. The second equation, add 9 to both sides, giving us x equals 9, our second solution. And the third, subtract 7 from both sides, giving us x equals negative 7, our third and final solution. So 3 solutions to this equation. You can certainly check each one by substituting it back into the equation. You'd have to have all 3 of these solutions. Example 2, recognize the problem has an equal sign. The variable's exponent is 2, so a quadratic equation. Once again, it's already in standard form, set equal to 0. So begin by factoring. Greatest common factor, 5. Factor it out. It leaves us 5 times x squared minus 9, where then we can factor further using the difference of squares, x plus 3, x minus 3. At this point, it's completely factored. Once again, we have 3 factors, but we only set the factors that have a variable equal to 0. So this first factor, 5, doesn't have an x, doesn't have a variable, so we don't do anything with it. The next one, x plus 3, gets set equal to 0, and x minus 3 gets set equal to 0. So solve each equation. It gives us 2 solutions, negative 3 and positive 3. Example 3, another quadratic equation. Begin by setting it equal to 0, getting all your terms on one side. So we can move the negative 3y and 18 to the right, or this y squared to the left by subtracting y squared. And that's exactly what we'll do, writing it in standard form as we do that. Greatest common factor, we notice that the leading term is negative, so we want to factor out a negative or negative 1, making sure that leading term now is positive, which it is. Continue on factoring. Factors into y plus 6, y minus 3. So at this point, completely factored. 3 factors once again. Don't forget that negative is actually negative 1. But we're not going to do anything with it. It does not get set equal to 0 because it does not have a variable. Y plus 6 equals 0, y minus 3 equals 0, and solve. The first solution, subtract 6 from both sides, gives us negative 6. Add 3 to both sides, positive 3. Example 4, quadratic equation. Begin by setting it equal to 0, subtract 16 from both sides. No greatest common factor in this case, so difference of squares factors into z plus 4, z minus 4. 2 factors, they both obviously have a variable, set each one equal to 0 and solve. Z is equal to negative 4, Z is equal to a positive 4. Example 5, we see it's certainly not a linear equation. The exponent is actually 3, even too large for a quadratic, but we know it's not linear, so we're still going to follow the same steps for a quadratic, and once we factor out a greatest common factor, it will become quadratic. In the meantime, though, certainly have some simplifying to do. Distribute that 2x, get all your terms on one side of the equation, setting it equal to 0, and factor our greatest common factor, negative 2x, giving us negative 2x times 2x minus x minus 2 equal to 0. Continue on factoring, negative 2x times x minus 2 times x plus 1. It's completely factored, have a total of 3 factors. The first factor, negative 2x is equal to 0, set it equal to 0. Solve for x, divide both sides by negative 2. X is simply equal to 0, our first solution. The next equation, x minus 2 is equal to 0. Add 2 to both sides, giving us x is equal to 2, and x plus 1 is equal to 0. Subtract 1 from both sides, x is equal to negative 1. And example 6. Quadratic equation, begin by getting all your terms on one side of the equation, writing it in standard form. We see now no greatest common factor, a trinomial where a is not equal to 1. So begin by multiplying a times c, 8 times 3, 24. Listing the factors, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. So we have a couple pairs of factors that we could split up 10x using. We'll just go ahead and use the first one, giving us negative 2x and a positive 12x. Bring down the first term, bring down the last term, along with that equals 0, and now factor using the grouping method as we know. So completely factored, 2 factors, 4x minus 1 times 2x plus 3. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. First one, add 1 to both sides, divide by 4. So x is equal to 1/4. The second equation, subtract 3 from both sides, divide by 2, x is equal to negative 3/2. And once again, you could always be checking these solutions by plugging them back in, checking for any careless mistakes.